chased after him. 25 years, and his wife is gone, but he's still here. And the files aren't released. All right. Now, his father was high up in the CIA, and he was too at one point for a while. I'm talking where I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, yeah, both men, Lincoln and Kennedy, had vice presidents named Johnson. So we'll talk that the two Johnsons were not related. When Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson took office. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, but he would not leave his seat when everybody else left every Southerner left the Senate. He would not leave his seat. He stayed there. So Lincoln made him his vice president to try to keep the South happy. So when Lincoln was shot, Johnson became the president. Anyway, Johnson had to try to carry out the job of rebuilding the country. Johnson was the first president to be impeached, and we've only had two presidents who were impeached. Johnson and Clinton. I mean, Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. You might say, what about Nixon? Nixon was not impeached. When Nixon saw he was going to be impeached, now, and Nixon resigned. Now, what do I mean by impeached? Impeached means the House brings the charges. No president has ever been turned out of office. Now, we've had two that were impeached where the House brought the charge. The Senate has to vote by 2/3 to remove him from office. Johnson survived, and Bill Clinton survived. But Bill Clinton was impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached, but both of them survived the Senate. Nixon was going to be impeached, so he resigned. Now, there were 3 amendments passed, and all 3 of them had to do with slavery. The 3 amendments were the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th freed the slaves. If that weren't enough, you had to have another one to make them citizens. And if that weren't enough, you had to have another one to give them the right to vote. Now, this became a mockery, folks. We had 3 amendments. The slaves were freed. Okay, good enough. Citizens, not really. Even though the 14th Amendment said they were, and the 14th Amendment was passed, it's like a lot of other things that man passes. It was passed but not obeyed. The 15th Amendment was overturned. Folks, this is something that, this is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said the Southern people had the right to withhold the vote for blacks if the blacks could not pass the literacy test. The problem with the literacy test is, now folks, again, not to open up old wounds, but I got to tell the truth. Only a white-skinned person could pass it. There was a case where a black man with a PhD failed the literacy test, and an illiterate white man who couldn't even read it passed it. Yes, this actually happened in the South. You better have heard about this before. Yeah. The only way to pass the literacy test was to have a white skin. Every white man who took it passed it, and no black, hardly any blacks who took it passed it. They showed it one black man a literacy test one time. It was written in Chinese, and I said, "Can you read this?" Yeah, sure. You can. What is that? It says, "There won't be very many black people voting on election day." Well, we can maybe laugh from it. It wasn't funny at the time. But hey, I'm not covering up. This actually went on. And the Supreme Court, now, again, the Supreme Court was what you do. The Supreme Court should not have the power in a democracy it has. The Supreme Court overturned an amendment to the Constitution by simply stating that the South had the right to withhold the vote from blacks. It's in the records, folks. If you look, research, I think your book even gives the case. Now, women wanted to join in this movement also. We wanted to state, why not make the 15th Amendment equally applicable to women? The country was not ready for that yet. It was to be another, 55 years, I believe, 1919, before women actually got the right to vote. So from 1869 to 1919, you're talking about 50 years. Women finally got the right to vote. All right. The Southern blacks, in order to try to earn a living, resorted to sharecropping. Now, some of you who have maybe great-grandmothers they can recall talking to their great-grandmothers who can tell you about sharecropping is where you didn't own the land, but basically a bunch of black people would get together and farm the land and then split the proceeds from the land among themselves. So it was sharing, where you shared the work and shared the profits when you sold the product. It did not make the blacks rich because the price of cotton continued to go down, particularly what happened was Morocco started growing cotton and India started growing cotton, and all this helped bring the price down. But then, within a few years of this, the boll weevil hit the southern cotton. Did a lot to hurt the cotton industry. Now today we can handle the boll weevil, but at first it broke up a lot of southern cotton farmers. You don't see much cotton up here, but you'd go down south of Joe a little bit, and particularly go down in October, and you'll see cotton fields like everything. Do you see a lot of it here?
In Louisiana.
Louisiana, oh yeah, of course, yeah. Louisiana is a cotton state, along with Mississippi and along with South Georgia. A lot of those places like in there, cotton, Alabama, South Alabama, cotton growing states. Oh yeah, the book shows a picture of page 417 in my book of a black woman working a cotton field in Georgia. Well, Johnson could not get elected again after he became very unpopular. The Union re-elected Grant as president, the same man, the general. Grant became president, and for many years he was looked on as being the worst president the country ever had. With all respects, though, the period after a war is often followed by a period of very low public morality. Under Grant's administration, there was one scandal after another. Scandal involving money, particularly bribes, government contracts going to people who had bribed for the most, and things like that. Scandal after scandal that pockmarked Grant's administration. It's known that Grant himself was an honest man, but he trusted people who betrayed him. Something else I just learned about Grant within the last few weeks. When the war started, Grant was a slave owner. This I did not know. I mean, Grant was an Illinois man, Ohioan. He was an Ohioan. But again, some of these northern people had slaves, and I think Grant had some land in the south. But he owned a few slaves. But then when the Union called, he answered the war on the side of the Union and helped win the war. Something else about Grant, too. Everything he did in civilian life flopped. The only time he had success was in the Army. During the Mexican War, he went to West Point and had some success there. That's a military academy. Then he went and joined the Army and fought in the Mexican War, and he was successful there as a soldier. But otherwise, he was highly unsuccessful. In elementary school, he would draw horses on his copybooks. He'd get looked often for it. And one time he drew a rider on a horse and got 2 whippings, one for the horse and one for the rider. On the last day of class, the teacher said, "Now you think your parents are here, but," and they pointed the teacher on the switch, "You act up, you'll get it." No, this was in the old days. Well, Grant saw a horse outside grazing. He started drawing the horse, and before he knew it, the teacher sneaked around. Grant got it. This was Grant as a kid. And when he became president, his teacher, who was by then an really old retired man, I said, "I hope he doesn't draw horses on his 64s." Draw horses. Something about his generalship, though. Now I got to say this. He was a very, very laid-back gentleman. He was extremely introverted. And leaders oftentimes come from one extreme. Some are extremely extroverted. Grant was the other extreme. He would ask his officers, he wouldn't say, "You do this," but "You want to do this." When it came time to cross the Mississippi River was a mile wide. The people who crossed would be exposed. So he said, "I want some volunteers. Now, I'm warning you, this job is dangerous. Who's going to go across the river first and protect everybody else as they come across?" He got so many volunteers, he had to turn some away. This was the way he lived, and it worked. But it did not work in civilian life. But in the Army, it worked. He had success as a soldier. And one time, a bunch of officers got together with Mr. President Lincoln and said, "You got to get rid of him. He drinks. He looks like a slouch. He doesn't shave." This was true. I mean, Lincoln didn't either after a while. Yeah, he's a drunk. He's this and that. And Lincoln thought, "Listen, okay, man, I've heard your complaints, but I cannot spare this man. He fights. I have learned that wherever Grant is, things move." And Lincoln kept him on. And Grant kept on fighting until he wore Lee down. The other generals would take off running. Grant would stay there. Even his side was losing, he'd stay. And he eventually wore Lee down by sheer force of numbers. He once said, "I purpose to fight it out in this line if it takes all summer." Well, it took all summer, all fall, all winter, and then the next spring. But he fought it out in that line and won. But as president, the men he trusted betrayed him. He had one scandal after another, but he remained popular. Once he was out of office, he went into banking business. The banking business failed and Grant went broke, flat broke. Grant was at this time an old man. But he made some money. He was still popular, so he wrote a book, wrote about himself, his memoirs. I read part of his memoirs one time. But he wrote about his memoirs, and it made a lot of money for him, and he was able to become solid. About the only thing he did in civilian life that ever worked was write about himself. But he wrote about his military experiences, about his generalship, and even about his presidency. Anyway, this was the type of man Grant was. His picture, by the way, is on the $50 bill. If you don't worry about it, don't write that down. At least it was. Now they've changed it. Of course, I don't deal in cash much anymore. Whose picture is on the 20? It used to be Jackson. Who's on there now? Anybody know? They were going to put a woman on one of these. Harriet Tubman, I believe, or somebody like that. But I don't know anymore. Again, none of you know because nobody's using paper money anymore. All right.
$50 bill is cash.
Anyway, the Reconstruction period ended in 1877 when we elected a new president, another general named Hayes. General Rutherford B. Hayes. See, we had three generals in a row. General Grant, General Hayes, and General Garfield. Garfield only lasted 3 months as president. So we had three generals in a row. And anyway, when General Hayes was elected president, he was elected on the promise that he'd remove the last of the federal troops from the South. So when he's elected, the last of the federal troops were removed from the South, and this ended Reconstruction. In a book called Reconstruction, A Mission But Half Accomplished, it freed the slaves, but it did not make the former slaves anywhere near equal. The slaves at the end of it found themselves deeply impoverished, with hardly any chance to better themselves, and intimidated severely by the Ku Klux Klan. And a lot of them were lynched if they tried to protest or rise above their lot. A lot of them were lynched, and this kept them quiet. This was to go on for several more generations. The South became completely democratic. That's all right. That is amazing in view of what has happened since. All right, we can move on now to the West, 1865 to 1900. Your book opens up with a vignette about Christopher Columbus, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Now, in the 500th anniversary, in 1992, there was a movie made, which my wife and I watched. I want to say this about Columbus. He has fallen into a whole lot of disfavor here of late. I think I mentioned that earlier, so I think that you might know my take on it. I don't think the criticism of it is altogether fair, but I'll move on from there. Now, the Wild West. If you had grown up when I did, and I don't think any of you did, the most popular TV show in the 1950s and early 60s was the Western. I'll name them. 26 Men, Wagon Train, Jefferson Drum, and there was The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy. Any of you ever hear of these shows or watch them? Bonanza. These shows were about the West. And they picture the West as being a place that was wild and with a lot of outlaws. And oh yeah, there was Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp. Now Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were real people. The Lone Ranger was a fictional character. Wyatt Earp was real. So was Wild Bill Hickok. I mentioned him earlier. Wild Bill Hickok was a Western hero whose father had worked with the Underground Railroad. And Wild Bill then fought in the Union for the Civil War. Fought with the Union during the Civil War. Anyway, the West was very much untamed, and also a problem they had in the West was Indians, and they felt like they had to remove the last of the Indians. Eventually, the Indians were forced on reservations. And I remember asking my mother one time, well, Mom, what happened to the Indians? She said, most of them today live on reservations. Now, again, growing up in Pennsylvania, from the time I was 2 to the time I was 11, I never saw an Indian. There are no Indians left in Pennsylvania. I mean, there are people who claim they're part Indian. I mean, oh yes, a lot of Americans claim to be part Indian. And some of it is, they actually are, they can document it. But the Indians, she said, were put on reservations and they're still there. There is a move now to get them off the reservations. But at this time, they felt like that they told the Indians, hey, you go live on a reservation and there you'll be happy and there we'll finally leave you alone. And the Indians said, well, you were promising us that before and you haven't left us alone. But they began removing the Indians from their lands and forcing them to live on, oh yes, if you ever see an Indian reservation, one of my brothers did, they were living on very, very, very unproductive lands, mostly rock and hill with hardly any life, where nothing, no vegetation would grow, rattlesnake infested, very, very bad land. The buffalo. It was estimated that in 1815 there were 15 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. In other words, states like Nebraska, northern Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, and North and South Dakota. Then by 1890, there were only 600 known buffalo left. Fortunately, the hunting of buffalo was outlawed, and we don't allow buffalo hunting anymore. But the buffalo has made a comeback. Today, they've tried to substitute buffalo meat for cow meat, but buffalo burgers just simply do not catch the fancy of the American people. They call them beefalo burgers, but buffalo burgers. But the buffalo did not catch the fancy. But the buffalo was almost wiped out. Railroads were put in the West. They wanted to, but Stephen Douglas wanted a railroad to start from Chicago. Someone else wanted the railroad to start from Independence. Basically, I mean, if this were the United States, some people wanted the railroad to go a northerly route, some wanted to go a central route, and some wanted to go a southerly route. Eventually, all three got their way. There was a Union Pacific Railroad that went up into Oregon and Washington that started in Chicago. There was the Transcontinental Railroad that went from Independence, Missouri, all the way to California. And then there was the Southern Pacific Railroad that went through the southern part. So eventually they all three got their way. And the United States was linked, the Pacific Ocean was linked to the Atlantic. It was said to be part of our manifest destiny. Manifest destiny meant it was our God-given destiny that we expand from coast to coast. This was what we believed at the time. Oh yeah, about the railroads too. Chinese did a lot of work building these railroads, particularly in the western part. Chinese workers were cheap and they made good workers, and they did a lot to lay the track. Now, eventually the rail lines learned how to lay the track with pressure-treated lumber that would last for years. Today, of course, they use concrete instead of wooden ties. But at one time they used wooden ties. And railroad trestles would sometimes break and fall down under the weight of the heavy locomotive. Locomotives were very heavy. All right. Now, the Indians fought the white man over the Black Hills, and this fight is still going on. Here's the issue. At one time it was gold in the Black Hills. Today it's oil. We found oil not so much in the Black Hills, but in the Dakotas. And we have a lot of oil, but a lot of people don't want to get it. They say that taking this oil would be harmful to the environment. But the Indians were fighting us then. They're still fighting us over the oil issue. Indian children were forced to go to white schools where they learned white culture and learned how bad their own culture was. There was a famous Indian named Geronimo. Now, I'll say that Geronimo, there's a Dairy Queen in Douglasville where they have a picture of Geronimo and a story about him. Geronimo was a famous Indian who escaped a white man for a good many months, and he only had some 30 people with him. When he was found, it was the white people were just simply appalled at the terrible conditions that he was living under. They ragged, dirty people who were following him. But they said, "You mean we've spent all our time chasing these people?" Well, they appear insignificant. But then Geronimo went on. He was not killed. He went on to become something of a celebrity. Another Indian who became a celebrity was Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley. Now, do any of you know who I'm talking about? Sitting Bull, Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, right? Annie Oakley was a sharpshooter who could hit the head of a bird in flight, in mid-flight, and bring the bird down. And when she killed a bird with a gun, the bird you could eat it without worrying about breaking your teeth on the lead bullet, because she could hit the bird in the place where he wanted, like his head. But she could take the head off the bird in mid-flight. And some people have that kind of talent for a gun. I don't. Anyway, Annie Oakley and Sitting Bull and Buffalo Bill got together, and they went around the country, touring the country and putting on shows with Annie with her trick shooting. She could hold out a dime, like so. And somebody would hold out a dime, and she would shoot the dime out of a person's hand. Don't you try this. Don't try it, but she could. And we know it wasn't faker because they picked up the dime and it had been up where the bullet had hit it. So it wasn't like the person holding the dime dropped it. But she was a trick shooter. But she would perform her acts. But anyway, some of these Indians became famous. Eventually, those Sitting Bull went back west and joined the white resistance movement. The fighting was suicide. I mean, morally, the Indians were on higher ground. The white man was not keeping his treaties. Now, but the fighting was otherwise suicide. There was one battle, though, that went in favor of the Indians, and that was Custer. It's called Custer's Last Stand. General Custer was sent west to fight the Indians, and unknown to him, some Indian tribes had bunked together, even back then. Now, the Indians could not live more than 200 or 300 together. But you had a case where about 3,000 Indians got together, probably by accident. Custer was unaware of it. Custer split his men into 3 parts. And he and 276 other men, 277 total, were surrounded by the Indians and wiped out. It's called Custer's Last Stand. It was only significant victory for the Indians. But again, the Indians did themselves in because they started fighting among themselves like they always did when a bunch of them got together big time, and they split up after that and went their separate ways. If they could have stayed united, well, no, one Indian survivor of the battle went to a ceremony, and the Indians were invited to the ceremony, and they were told the war is over, and they listened to the white man's speeches, but this Indian said there was no point in this fighting. We couldn't win, there were too many of them. They just kept on coming. We could defeat Custer and kill all of his 277 men, but they'd send a bunch more in their place, and ultimately we were destined to lose. Just too many of them. Anyway, that was one of the few fights that went the Indians' way. Mining, gold prospecting became the big thing. Wyatt Earp went there to prospect. Now, I've already mentioned how a lot of Chinese people came to the West. The Chinese had a population explosion, and here's why, basically. The smallpox vaccination was invented, as well as it was learned that bacteria cause disease, and that bacteria could be killed by sanitation or by boiling or heating water, pasteurization. The Chinese couples were not having any more babies than normal, but it was more of their babies growing up. Now, at one time, the Chinese couple might have 10 babies, only 5 of them grow up. Maybe even less than that, 3 or 4 of them grow up. But now they were having 10 babies and 9 of them were growing up. So the Chinese were having the same number of children they always had, except with better health, more knowledge about germs, and with the smallpox vaccination, their babies were growing up. And a bunch of Chinese men and women found themselves with more land. The Chinese were on a farmland, so these Chinese went across the Pacific to the New World. Some of them went to Mexico, a bunch of them went to Jamaica, and a bunch of them went to California. Eventually, the United States decided they didn't want them, and folks, again, this issue is somewhat fighting on this date, June 29, 2018. The government passed the Chinese Expulsion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to keep the Chinese out of our country. The Chinese Exclusion Act. We also limited our Japanese population. All of this was to lead to tensions between these Far Eastern peoples and us in the United States, tensions that still go on. Anyway, the Homestead Act was passed. Lincoln signed into law. The Homestead Act simply stated that if you lived on the land for 5 years, the land became yours. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean you could have moved on Joe Smith's land and then said, I've been living here for 5 years, it's my land. If you could move on government property, and if you went to and lived on government property and staked it out, in other words, said this is my boundary, as opposed to your neighbors, if you staked it out and lived there for 5 years, the land became yours. It's called the Homestead Act. It was passed by everything. It encouraged a lot of people to move west. Then, of course, the train. Your book says, I mentioned 3, but your book says there were 4 railroads people could choose from that would take them west. And a lot of people went by train instead of a covered wagon. A covered wagon trip took 5 or 6 months to make it. A train, maybe 7 or 8 days. The trains could travel day and night. Now, of course, they'd stop at the stations along the way. They had to refuel, of course, like everyone else. But they would stop along the way. All right. Oh yeah, I see the map now on page 449 of my book about the 4 railroad lines. 2 of them went through the south, 1 of them went to the far north, and 1 of them kind of split the difference. All right. Oh yeah, the cowboy became a big part of the scene. And yes, the cowboy was the big feature of the Western shows in the 1950s.